He thought it was just another routine stop, until the man he chose to accuse turned out to be the one watching everything. The red and blue lights cut through the quiet street like a warning no one could ignore, reflecting off the polished surface of a midnight black sedan parked neatly along the curb in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Baltimore, where the houses sat evenly spaced and the night air carried the faint hum of distant traffic. And inside that car sat Marcus Reed, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed forward as if he had already played this moment in his mind 100 times before, because sometimes you don't need to be told something is about to go wrong. You can feel it in the silence, in the way the air tightens around you, in the way a simple traffic stop suddenly feels heavier than it should. And when the patrol car door opened and Officer Daniel Hayes stepped out with that slow, deliberate walk, Marcus didn't flinch, didn't reach for anything, didn't even turn his head right away, because he knew that sudden movements were often misread, and tonight he couldn't afford to be misunderstood, not even for a second, not with everything at stake, not with the operation hanging by a thread thinner than anyone on that street could see. But Hayes didn't see any of that, didn't care to, because from where he stood, badge catching the streetlight just right. This was simple, too simple, a black man sitting in a car that didn't fit, in a neighborhood that didn't match. And that assumption settled into his mind before a single word was spoken, shaping everything that came next. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, voice flat but edged with something sharper underneath, something that didn't ask, only expected. And for a brief second, Marcus closed his eyes, just long enough to steady the rhythm of his breathing, because this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about control, about perception, about how quickly a moment could spiral when one person decided they already knew the truth. And as Marcus slowly opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, he could already feel the shift, the weight of eyes from nearby houses, the faint glow of porch lights flickering on, silhouettes forming behind curtains, and somewhere, someone lifting a phone, because scenes like this didn't stay private anymore. They became stories, they became headlines, they became something bigger than the people involved. And yet Hayes moved closer, scanning the car, shaking his head slightly, as if confirming something he had already decided. "This vehicle's been reported stolen," he said, loud enough for anyone watching to hear. And just like that, the line was drawn, not by evidence, not by fact, but by assumption, and Marcus felt it settle over him like a weight, heavy but familiar, the kind you learn to carry without showing it, because reacting too quickly could make things worse. And so he kept his voice even, calm, measured. "Officer, that's my car," he said, not defensive, not aggressive, just clear. But Hayes barely glanced at him, already reaching for his radio, already building a version of the story that didn't include doubt, didn't include possibility, didn't include the truth standing right in front of him. And in that moment, standing under the flashing lights with the quiet neighborhood watching, Marcus knew something that no one else did, something that would change everything. But not yet, because timing was everything. And sometimes the most powerful move was to wait. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and tense, like a wire pulled too tight between 2 points that refused to move. And Marcus stood there under the glow of flashing lights, hands visible, posture steady, watching Officer Hayes circle the car, as if the truth might reveal itself just by looking hard enough. But it was not the car Hayes was really examining. It was the idea in his head, the version of the story he had already decided was real. And when he stopped near the driver's side door, glancing inside with narrowed eyes, his voice came sharper this time, louder, meant to carry. "Step away from the vehicle completely." And Marcus took a slow step back onto the cool asphalt, the faint sound of gravel shifting under his shoes echoing louder than it should have in the quiet neighborhood, because moments like this always felt amplified, every movement, every breath, every second stretching longer than it should. And somewhere across the street a porch light flicked on fully, a curtain pulled just enough for someone to see without being seen. And Marcus could feel it, the attention building, the quiet judgment forming before facts ever had a chance to speak. And still he remained calm, because calm was not weakness. Calm was control, and control was the only thing he could afford to lose. Not now, not here, not when the operation depended on precision, on timing, on silence. And Hayes keyed his radio again, his tone shifting into something official, something that sounded like procedure but felt like confirmation. Dispatch. I have a possible stolen vehicle, requesting verification on plate number. And the numbers rolled off his tongue quickly, confidently, as if there was no room for error, no room for doubt. And Marcus listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, because interrupting would not help. Explaining too soon would not help. There was a process unfolding here, one that had already been set in motion the second those lights turned on behind him. And when Hayes turned back toward him, there was a look in his eyes that said everything without saying anything, a look that had already made its decision. "You got an explanation for this?" he asked, but it was not a question. It was a test, and Marcus knew that tone, knew that edge, the kind that did not invite answers but judged them before they were spoken. And for a brief second, Marcus glanced toward the end of the street, toward the darkness beyond the reach of the flashing lights, calculating, measuring, waiting, because somewhere not too far from here, unseen, unheard, was a line that could not be crossed, a line that tied him to something much bigger than this moment, something that could not be exposed, not yet. And so he spoke carefully, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. "The registration is in the glove compartment," he said, voice even, controlled. But Hayes shook his head almost immediately, dismissing it with a small motion that carried more weight than it should have. "Do not move," he said firmly, stepping closer, his presence filling the space between them, not aggressive, but authoritative in a way that made it clear this was no longer about a simple check. This was about control, about who held it and who did not. And Marcus felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable, the way the moment was closing in, narrowing, turning from a misunderstanding into something else entirely. And then the radio crackled, a burst of static, cutting through the air, both men turning their attention to it. And for just a second, just a fraction of a second, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next, because sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes through a quiet voice over a radio and changes everything. The crackle from the radio did not sound urgent at first, just another routine response cutting through static. But the moment the dispatcher's voice came through, steady and clear, something shifted in the air, something subtle yet unmistakable. "Unit 12, be advised. The vehicle is registered to Marcus Reed." And for a fraction of a second, the words hung there, unfinished in their meaning, because the next part mattered more than the first, and Marcus heard it before Hayes fully processed it. "Registered owner confirmed, no report of theft on file." And silence followed, not the calm kind, but the kind that presses in, heavy, uncomfortable, forcing everyone in that moment to confront what had just been said. And Hayes stood still, radio in hand, eyes fixed somewhere between Marcus and the car, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. Because the story he had already built in his mind was now unraveling, thread by thread, and yet instead of stepping back, instead of letting the truth settle, he exhaled slowly and shifted his stance, tightening his grip on control the only way he knew how. "Dispatch, run it again," he said, voice firmer now, almost resistant, as if repetition might change the outcome. But the dispatcher did not hesitate, did not soften the response. "Negative, officer. Vehicle is clear. Registered to Marcus Reed. Address matches driver's license on record." And there it was, complete, undeniable, leaving no room for interpretation. But still, Hayes did not fully let go of the version he had created, because sometimes admitting a mistake is harder than holding onto a wrong belief. And Marcus watched it happen in real time. The hesitation, the flicker of doubt, the decision forming behind Hayes's eyes. And for a moment, it could have ended there. It could have been a simple correction, a quiet acknowledgement, a step back into reason. But instead Hayes took a step forward, closing the space again, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with something unresolved. "Then why are you out here sitting in it?" he asked. And the question was not about the car anymore. It was about justification, about finding something, anything, that would make the situation make sense in the way he needed it to. And Marcus held his gaze, calm, steady, because this was the moment where most people would react, where frustration would rise, where words would come faster than thought. But Marcus did not move, did not raise his voice, did not give Hayes what he expected. Instead, he simply said, Because it is mine. And the simplicity of that answer seemed to echo louder than anything else that had been said, cutting through the tension in a way that made everything else feel unnecessary. And somewhere behind them, a car slowed as it passed. The driver glancing over, taking in the scene, and a phone lifted higher from across the street, capturing every second, every hesitation, every choice being made in real time. And Hayes could feel it now, the shift in control slipping, not completely, but enough to make the moment uncomfortable, enough to make the narrative uncertain. And for the first time since he stepped out of his patrol car, there was a pause in his movement, a break in his certainty, and Marcus noticed it, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with calculation. Because this was not over, not yet, not until the truth was fully seen, not just heard over a radio, but understood. And as the flashing lights continued to paint the street in alternating colors, Marcus knew something Hayes did not, something that would soon turn this moment into something much bigger than a misunderstanding. Because the truth was already here, it just had not revealed its full weight yet, and when it did, there would be no way to step back from it. Hayes shifted his weight, the confidence he had carried just minutes ago no longer as solid as it once was. But instead of stepping back, instead of letting the situation settle into what it clearly was, he doubled down in a quieter way. The kind of quiet that tried to reclaim authority without admitting fault. "Stay where you are," he said, his tone controlled, measured, as if he were recalibrating rather than correcting. And Marcus remained still, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. Because he had seen this before, not just in moments like this on the street, but in rooms where decisions were made, in reports that were written, in systems that often moved slower than the truth itself. And what mattered now was not just what had happened, but what would happen next. Because moments like this rarely ended with a single correction. They revealed something deeper, something that lingered long after the lights were gone. And Hayes took a slow breath, glancing once more at the car, then back at Marcus, searching for something he could hold on to, something that would justify the tension still hanging in the air. "Identification," he said finally, extending his hand slightly, not aggressively, but with expectation. And Marcus paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of calculation, because every action now had weight. Every movement could shift the direction of what came next. And he reached slowly into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet with deliberate care, making sure every motion was visible, every step controlled, because control was still his, even if it did not look that way from the outside. And when he handed over his identification, Hayes took it, his eyes scanning the card, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he read the name again. Marcus Reed. The same name that had just come through the radio, the same name that had already been confirmed. And yet there was something about seeing it in his hand, something about holding the proof that made it harder to ignore, harder to dismiss. And for a moment, Hayes said nothing, just stared at the card, then back at Marcus, as if trying to match the reality in front of him with the assumptions he had made. And the gap between those two things was becoming impossible to ignore. And still, instead of acknowledging it, he asked another question, one that did not belong to the situation anymore. "What do you do for work?" And the question lingered there, not because it mattered, but because it gave him something to hold on to, something to keep control of the conversation. And Marcus heard it clearly, understood exactly what it was, and chose his response carefully, because this was not the moment for the full truth. Not yet. "I work in investigations," he said, his voice calm, even, offering just enough without revealing everything. And Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly, the answer landing in a way that did not fully register, not yet, because the words meant one thing on the surface and something entirely different beneath it. And Marcus could see the hesitation, the uncertainty beginning to take shape. And across the street, more lights had come on, more eyes watching. The quiet neighborhood no longer quiet. The moment expanding beyond just the two of them, becoming something witnessed, something recorded, something that would not simply disappear when it was over. And Hayes handed the identification back, slower this time, his movements less certain, less automatic, as if each action now required thought instead of instinct. And for the first time, there was a pause that did not feel forced, a silence that did not belong to tension, but to realization slowly forming. And Marcus felt it, not as relief, but as a shift, the kind of shift that happens just before everything changes, because the truth had already been confirmed, but it had not yet been accepted, and when acceptance finally came, it would not just end the moment, it would redefine it, and somewhere in the distance, faint but growing closer, the low hum of another engine began to cut through the night, steady, deliberate, and Marcus did not turn to look, because he already knew what was coming, and more importantly, he knew Hayes did not. The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, steady and unmistakable, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate in a way that carried authority without needing to announce it. And Hayes heard it now, his head turning slightly toward the end of the street as a dark SUV rolled into view, its headlights cutting clean lines through the flashing red and blue already painting the pavement, and something about the way it moved, the way it slowed without hesitation, signaled that this was not coincidence. This was arrival, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, posture unchanged, eyes forward, because this was the moment he had been waiting for, not with anticipation, not with relief, but with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing the sequence of events has already been set in motion long before anyone else realizes it. And Hayes straightened subtly, adjusting his stance as the SUV came to a stop a few yards behind his patrol car, the engine idling low, the doors still closed for just a second longer than expected, a pause that stretched just enough to draw attention, to shift the energy of the scene, and then the driver's side door opened, followed by the passenger door, and two individuals stepped out, both dressed in dark suits that did not need badges to command presence, their movements calm, precise, their focus already locked onto the scene in front of them, and Hayes watched them approach, his expression tightening again, this time not from certainty, but from something closer to uncertainty, because this was no longer a situation he fully controlled, and one of the men reached into his jacket, briefly flashing a credential that caught the light just enough to be seen, just enough to be understood, and even from a distance, it carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation, and Marcus finally turned his head slightly, acknowledging their presence with nothing more than a glance, a silent confirmation that everything was unfolding exactly as it should, and as the two men closed the distance, one of them spoke first, his voice calm but firm, cutting cleanly through the tension that had been building for minutes. "Officer, we need to speak with you." And there was no aggression in the tone, no raised volume, just clarity, the kind that leaves little room for resistance, and Hayes hesitated, just for a moment, his eyes flicking between Marcus and the approaching agents, trying to piece together a situation that was no longer aligning with what he thought it was, and Marcus watched it all unfold with quiet focus, because this was the point where perception begins to shift, where the story changes not with force, but with information, with presence, with truth stepping into the light, and the second agent turned his attention briefly to Marcus, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of acknowledgement alone, but of confirmation, and in that simple gesture, everything that had been hidden beneath the surface began to rise, not all at once, but enough to alter the balance of the moment, and Hayes felt it, whether he understood it fully or not. The way the situation was no longer his to define, no longer his to control, and the quiet neighborhood that had been watching now seemed even stiller, as if every observer sensed that something had just changed, something important, something irreversible, and Marcus exhaled slowly, not out of tension, but out of timing, because the truth had not been revealed yet, not completely, but it was no longer hidden either. It was here, standing, just a few feet away, waiting to be spoken, and when it was, there would be no confusion left, no assumptions to hold on to, only the reality of what had just happened, and what it would mean for everyone involved. The air felt different now, not louder, not more chaotic, but heavier with meaning, as if the moment itself had shifted from uncertainty into something far more defined, and Officer Hayes stood there, caught between the version of events he had constructed and the reality that was now standing just a few feet away from him, embodied in the two agents who had arrived without urgency, but with unmistakable purpose. And the first agent stepped slightly forward, his posture straight, his tone measured. "Officer Hayes, correct?" he asked, not because he did not know, but because the question itself carried formality, procedure, the beginning of something official, and Hayes nodded once, slower than before, his confidence no longer automatic. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady but lacking the earlier edge, and the agent gave a small acknowledgement before continuing. "We are going to need a moment." And the phrasing was calm, but the implication was clear. This situation had moved beyond a routine stop, beyond a simple misunderstanding. And Hayes glanced briefly toward Marcus, as if searching for something in his expression, some clue that might help him understand what was unfolding. But Marcus did not offer anything beyond what he had already shown: composure, control, patience, because this was not the moment for explanation, it was the moment for revelation. And the second agent now turned his full attention to Marcus, stepping closer with a quiet respect that had not been present before. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice lower, more direct, and in that single address, using his name without hesitation, without doubt, the entire dynamic shifted again, more clearly this time, more visibly, because names carry weight when they are spoken with certainty, and Hayes heard it, felt it, the way the situation was slipping further from his grasp, and Marcus finally moved, just slightly, enough to face the agents more directly, his posture unchanged but his presence now unmistakably different, no longer just a man standing beside a car, but someone who had been holding something back, something that was now beginning to surface. And the first agent reached into his jacket once more, this time holding the credential longer, allowing it to be seen not just in passing, but clearly, deliberately, and even though the details were not spoken aloud, the authority behind it was undeniable. And Hayes's eyes followed the motion, lingering just a moment too long, as if trying to read what was written there, as if hoping it would not confirm what he was beginning to suspect. And the agent spoke again, his tone unchanged, but the words now carried a finality that could not be ignored. "Mr. Reed is part of an ongoing investigation," he said, each word placed carefully, each one closing the gap between assumption and truth. And the street seemed to fall even quieter, the distant hum of traffic fading into the background as the weight of that statement settled into the space between them. And Hayes did not respond immediately, because there was no immediate response that could undo what had already been done, no quick explanation that could realign the moment back to where it had started. And Marcus watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the calm understanding of someone who had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. Because this was never just about a traffic stop, never just about a car. It was about perception, about assumption, about the thin line between authority and accountability. And as the flashing lights continued to pulse against the quiet homes around them, illuminating faces behind windows and phones held steady in the dark, the truth stood fully present now, no longer hidden, no longer waiting, and all that remained was what would be done with it. Hayes did not move right away, not because he did not understand what had just been said, but because understanding it meant accepting it, and accepting it meant confronting the reality that everything leading up to this moment had been built on something that no longer held. And the words "ongoing investigation" echoed in his mind with a weight that was impossible to ignore, reshaping the scene around him, turning what had felt like control into something fragile, something uncertain. And he glanced again at Marcus, but this time the look was different, no longer searching for confirmation of suspicion, but trying to reconcile how he had missed something so significant, something that had been standing in front of him the entire time. And Marcus met that look with the same calm expression, unchanged, steady, because this was not about proving a point, it was about letting the truth exist exactly as it was, without force, without exaggeration. And the first agent took another step forward, his presence now clearly establishing the shift in authority. "Officer Hayes, we are going to need you to step aside," he said, the tone still even, but now unmistakably directive. And Hayes hesitated, just long enough for the moment to stretch again, just long enough for the weight of what was happening to settle fully into place. And then he stepped back, one measured step, creating space where moments ago there had been tension. And that single movement spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it marked the point where control had changed hands, not abruptly, not forcefully, but undeniably. And Marcus exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of timing, because everything was now unfolding exactly as it needed to. And the second agent turned slightly, positioning himself between Hayes and Marcus, not as a barrier, but as a line, a clear distinction between what had been and what was now. And from across the street, the faint glow of phone screens reflected off windows, capturing every second, every shift, every decision, because moments like this did not disappear. They lingered, they traveled, they became something larger than the street they happened on. And Hayes lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in realization, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been set in motion. And when he looked back up, his expression had changed, the certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something more aware. And Marcus noticed it, not as satisfaction, but as confirmation, that the moment had reached its turning point, because this was where perception breaks, where assumptions fall apart under the weight of truth. And the first agent spoke again, this time directing his attention back to Marcus, his voice softer but still clear. "We have it from here." And Marcus gave a small nod, nothing more, because there was nothing left for him to say in this moment, nothing that needed to be explained. The truth had already spoken for itself, and as the flashing lights continued to pulse against the quiet houses, illuminating faces that had witnessed everything without ever stepping outside, the scene settled into a new kind of silence, one that no longer carried tension, but consequence, because what had happened here could not be undone, and what would follow would not be decided in this moment. But it had already begun, quietly, inevitably, the second the truth stepped into the light. The street no longer felt like the same place it had been just minutes ago, not because anything visible had changed, the lights still flashing, the houses still quiet, the night still wrapped in that same cool stillness, but because the meaning of everything had shifted, and meaning has a way of transforming even the most ordinary scene into something else entirely. And Hayes stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center of the moment, no longer directing it, but watching it unfold from the outside. And that alone carried more weight than any words could have, because authority does not disappear loudly. It fades in silence, in small movements, in the space between what was expected and what actually happened. And the agents moved with calm precision, their focus no longer on questioning, but on resolution, on closing the gap between confusion and clarity. And one of them spoke quietly into a phone, not hurried, not alarmed, just controlled, relaying information that would continue far beyond this street, beyond this moment, because what had happened here was not isolated. It was part of something larger, something that would now be documented, reviewed, understood in ways that extended far past what anyone watching from behind their windows could fully grasp. And Marcus stood near his car, posture unchanged, but presence different, no longer simply reacting to the situation, but existing above it, separate from the tension that had once surrounded him. And for a brief second, he looked at the reflection of the flashing lights across the hood of his car, the same car that had been questioned, the same car that had triggered everything. And there was something almost quiet about that reflection now, something that carried more than just light. It carried the weight of what had just been revealed. And Hayes shifted again, his eyes moving from the agents to Marcus and back again, as if trying to piece together the final understanding. And it came slowly, not all at once, but enough to change the way he stood, the way he held himself, because realization does not always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it comes in fragments, in the gradual awareness that something important has been missed, something that cannot be undone. And one of the agents finally turned toward him again, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Hayes, your supervisor has been notified," he said. And those words landed differently than everything before them, because they pointed forward, not backward. They signaled that what had happened here was not ending. It was continuing, just in a different form. And Hayes nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried acceptance, because there was nothing else left to hold on to, no assumption left to defend. And Marcus watched him for a moment, not with judgment, not with anger, but with the quiet understanding that this was the part most people never see, the part where the moment settles, where the truth remains after everything else falls away. And the neighborhood seemed to exhale with it, the tension easing into something quieter, something more reflective. And the phones that had been held steady began to lower, the observers stepping back into their homes, the scene no longer something unfolding, but something that had already happened, something that would be talked about, remembered, replayed in ways that extended far beyond this street. And Marcus took a slow breath, not because he needed to, but because it marked the transition, the shift from tension to outcome, from question to answer. And as the agents continued their work with quiet efficiency, the truth stood fully visible now, no longer questioned, no longer hidden, simply present, undeniable, and permanent in the way that only truth can be once it has been revealed. The flashing lights began to lose their intensity, not because they had dimmed, but because the moment itself no longer needed them to define it. And what remained was something quieter, something more lasting, the kind of silence that settles in after truth has fully taken its place. And Marcus stood beside his car, the same place where everything had started. But nothing about it felt the same anymore, because the weight of what had just happened lingered in ways that could not be undone. And across the street the last of the onlookers retreated behind closed doors, their curiosity replaced by reflection, their phones lowered, their voices quiet, because they had witnessed something that went beyond a simple stop, something that carried a message they might not fully understand yet, but would not easily forget. And Hayes remained where he was, no longer at the center, no longer holding the authority that had once defined his every movement. And as the agents continued speaking in low, measured tones, relaying details that would move this moment into reports, into decisions, into consequences that would unfold far from this street, Hayes finally looked directly at Marcus again, not with the sharp certainty from before, not with suspicion, but with something more complicated, something closer to realization. And for a brief second, there was no rank between them, no badge, no position, just two people standing in the aftermath of a moment that had revealed more than either of them had said out loud. And Marcus met that look without hostility, without triumph, because this was never about winning. It was about truth being seen, about dignity remaining intact even when it was questioned, even when it was tested in ways that should not have happened. And the first agent stepped back slightly, giving Marcus a small nod that signaled closure, not just for the situation, but for the role he had played within it. And Marcus understood it immediately, because his part in this moment had never been about confrontation. It had been about endurance, about holding steady long enough for the truth to surface on its own. And he reached for his car door, his movements calm, deliberate, the same controlled rhythm he had maintained from the very beginning. And as he opened it, the reflection of the street lights shifted across the surface once more, no longer carrying tension, but carrying resolution. And before he stepped inside, he paused for just a fraction of a second, not to speak, not to make a point, but simply to exist in that moment, to acknowledge what had just happened without needing to define it. Because some moments do not need words, they carry their meaning in silence. And as he got into the car and closed the door, the sound was soft but final, marking the end of something that had begun as an assumption and ended as a lesson. And the engine started smoothly, the familiar hum grounding the moment back into something ordinary. And as Marcus pulled away from the curb, the flashing lights remained behind, smaller with each passing second, until they became nothing more than distant reflections in the rearview mirror. And Hayes stood there watching, the reality of what had